Hello, Jeando.
Good morning, Kevin.
In the last video, we've been talking about the doctrines of antagonistic action and mechanical advantage, and you only just started and gave us an overview. So there's plenty more to talk about on this subject. So over to you.
Yes, there is plenty more to talk about it, and especially because along the last 20 years, I've had many discussions, and I've written a lot about these two sentences or three sentences, and they really somehow um, shape the way I teach much more than anything else. So it's quite important. The doctrine of antagonistic action and the position of mechanical advantage, they are central to the direction of the mind. I am explaining to the pupil how they can, in fact, start to take command, start to become the agent instead of following their somatic directive, their feelings, what should feel nice, what should be right because it feels nice. There is this big problem that, well, for example, we are going to speak somehow about the extension of the legs, the extension of the knees, and I teach the extension of the knees, and very often with people that have had a very strong misuse of the knees during their lives. I work with Alexander teachers, and some of them, without knowing, have very strong habits of flexion and extension of the knees, and they suffer for it. And when I first start to explain the proportion of movements of the different parts of the knees to these people, and they start to experiment, there is a moment of fright, and the lesson is slowing down to a halt, and the person shouts, "Oh, a very sharp pain in the knee." Every single time there is a comment that comes out of the teacher, and the teacher say, "I must use myself wrongly because I felt a sharp pain in the knee." And when you observe the videos of the session, you start to find a pattern. In fact, at the moment they had the sharp pain in the knee was the moment when they really started to extend. So you discover that correct conditions of functioning are at first associated with something that cannot be more wrong. What could be more wrong than having a pain somewhere? You know, you must think, "Oh dear, I must be doing something very..." Oh, in fact, what they mean is, "You are making me do something that is awfully wrong." That is the real message, that they convey. Because most of the time they are either American or Australian or English. They are very their comment is not going to be direct, but that's what it means. Yeah, and nope. I am not asking them to do anything wrong, and I show them, and then I use their hands. I ask them to take hold of the thigh and make some adjustments and perform exactly the same extension, and then suddenly they say, "Wow, that's strange. I don't have the pain anymore." which goes to reassure them in the wrong way finally, because they are settled in the idea that if there is pain, it must be wrong. If there is enormous tension, it must be wrong. It's a shame. But we need to pass through these moments, and we will have to come back to it and explain that what is wrong, what feels absolutely wrong, because it's painful many times. Well, if you are guided with reasoning, is not. It's very possible that the strong fascias of the knees have been so misused that some of them have been out of action for many years. And when a fascia is out of action for many years, there are different things that happen. One is, of course, that you lose the elasticity and the power in the fascia. It has to be reconstructed. But second, and it's more in line with what is happening in this example, is that the different sheets of the fascia that should slide and move above one another have in fact grown inconsiderate adhesions, what we call bonds that are unwanted. And the first thing that happens when you create a series of movement that is leading to a position of mechanical advantage, the stretch of the fascia is restructuring the fascia, which is a nice word to say that it's breaking the unwanted bonds. And sometimes, yes, sometimes people will feel that. And and because of the pain, we have all this reaction that when we have pain somewhere, we are going to stop all movements. The idea here is exactly the opposite. It's to convince the pupil that we are creating conditions, and these conditions are going to be reinforced and promoted by, well, exactly that, doing the movements. So it's important to, in fact, reassure the person that nothing wrong is happening. In fact, a wrong feeling doesn't mean something wrong is happening. So we were discussing antagonistic action and position of rigidity. Let's go back to the slides. Here is what it was about. I linked the process of creating, in the process of creating a coordination. Alexander is often using the same procedure of explaining the means of creating a position of mechanical advantage, and the one he describes, a position where the student is leaning backward on a chair. And the question is, how is that position possible when the support is only at the top of the structure? Why is the torso not caving in? And therefore, it's possible to explain what Alexander means by a position of rigidity. And there are other places where he talks about a rigidity essential. And so the rigidity essential here is that the torso is kept in the mode, it's kept lengthening and widening while it's leaning back at a cantilever and with the sole support on the neck. It's obvious that Alexander's hands at this age, at more than 80, cannot support the weight of the torso. He's not providing that kind of help. The pupil has to be the agent. Well, it has to be the agent of change. Here, it has to be the agent that is giving himself the instructions that allow this psychophysical activity to take place. So we are discussing a psychophysical factor, and we are going to see what is that psychophysical factor. But before that, I want to come back once again onto the rigidity essential. How can we explain the rigidity essential? So I said this has to do with the complete wrapping of the human structure by fascia, which respond to mechanical strain. That is, when you lengthen these elastics, then these elastics start to produce elastic resistance. And elastic resistance can be used in order to create what Alexander calls a position of rigidity. A position which resists deformation. This is what we call a position of rigidity. And so, there are other teachers that have been discussing these questions, and of course I read everything that I could about Delsart, and there is one very well-known writer. It's called, he was a priest de l'Aumône, and in 1874, long before Alexander started to he was very young at that age, long before he started to teach. is explaining the Delsart system in words that are not easy to understand, but that will bring some sense to Alexander, well, delivery that is really abrupt. We don't know exactly what Alexander is talking about. So you can only create your own translation, your own understanding of Alexander words, as I've done. So why not explore wider, and why not see if there could have been some influences that Alexander would have known about and certainly used. Well, why not? So in the Delsart system, there are definitions, and what constitutes the procedure of Delsart is to restructure the self using verbal instructions. It's very, very similar to the Alexander technique. And they use different ideas, and they use the idea of the static. And the static is what I will understand as position, if you want. And there is a dynamic. And the dynamic, as we've discovered, that Alexander is talking of the means whereby movements, I think that the dynamic relates to the means whereby movements. So the static, how do we understand the static? For Delomone, or well, is simply quoting Delsart, it is the science of the equipoise of levers. It teaches the weight of the parts and the extent of their development in order to maintain the equilibrium of the body. Its criterion should be a sort of balance. The dynamic is the action of equiponderant forces through the static. It regulates the proportion of movement the soul would impress upon the body. The foundation and criterion of the dynamic is the law of the pendulum. Once again, many people would say that this is certainly not bringing light to the question. It's even more obscure. You have to think about this, and well, once again, it's obvious that it's only in working with this sentence and making your own sense in the sentence that you can progress. That's what I've done. It's quite a strange way, but when you're lost, when you cannot understand the writer you're translating, well, you have to go to extreme means. So there was something that was very interesting in Delsart. It's the notion of levers, the notion that rigid object can be used, and in the sense that when you use a lever, when you direct a lever, it's obvious that you're directing the movement of the lever around a fulcrum. And so for me, this was very important, because I started to understand that the parts, Alexander is talking about the parts, the adjustment of the parts. I started to understand that the parts, if they are attached to the tissues, the elastic tissues of the self, they can be used to, in fact, stretch the parts. And as a result, they are going to, by their movements, these levers are going to promote, well, the stability through lengthening elastic resistance. So suddenly it was obvious that the muscles were not the center of the motion, and when the science of equipoise of levers teaches the weight of the parts, I started to realize that when we readjust movements, obviously at first we've got this temptation to find the muscles which through their action are going to create the movement, because we have this habit of mind of thinking that if there is a movement, well, that movement must be produced by a force coming from the muscles. Yes, but what Delsart is offering, this idea that he's offering, and you will see it makes a lot of sense, is that it could be possible to use the weight of the parts. Why would you teach the weight of the parts? Let's say that the different parts of the torso have weights. What does it mean? Well, it means that you could play with falling, for example. Falling is a movement that is in fact powered by the weight of the parts. You don't have to use much muscle in order to fall. It's very interesting to think that, wow, you could inhibit the constant action of the muscles, because very often for example, in the modern Alexander technique where I trained, the idea that co-contraction, the activity of the muscle, antagonistic muscle around a joint, was going to, in fact, compress the joint. And this idea is absolutely correct. Co-contraction is a way of stopping the movement of the joint, but I think it's the wrong way. You can absolutely damage joints, and this constant tension that is used in order to maintain equilibrium is not the solution. It's certainly not the idea of Alexander or of Delsart. Now, how do you, if you stop holding, how do you maintain the resistance to deformation of the structure of the torso? Why is it that the torso is not folding when you're in cantilever, when you're leaning, for example? How to lean forward, in fact, is a very interesting procedure. And I remember that my big question started this way when at the end of my training course I went to visit the McDonald's school, and they made fun of us young teachers that were pulling down when leaning forward. And well, they had every reason to make fun of us, because yes, we were pulling down in leaning forward. We were not in a position of mechanical advantage, in the sense that there was no essential rigidity. We were so used to releasing muscle tension that yes, we were pulling down. It was absolutely true, and it was seen on the video. It was absolutely visible and undeniable. While in fact their way of using well, the torso was very little different. And I suddenly realized that, well, they could make fun of us, absolutely, because when I was starting to observe their video of their performance, I started to notice that, well, in many ways, they were not more advanced than we were. We were all in the same boat, yes? Now, Alexander gives us some direction of reasoning. There is in the sentence he's writing, I do not find the definite answer. What I find is more questions, and so I'm using Delsart in the same way to find more questions. So, teaching the weight of the parts, we are going to see that yes, that can be very interesting to learn how to use the weight, so I'm teaching my pupil to fall very clearly, and so there is also the teaching of the extent of their development. Well, that you must understand, first of all, is a translation from the French, and second, it's not even modern French. It's French that is from the 19th century, and so you had to do a little bit of digging in dictionaries, in all dictionaries, and in order to understand what is the meaning of this extent of their development. Extent of the development of the parts. Well, we are not discussing physical development. You know, we are not discussing how a baby will develop into an adult. It's not. It's not at all this. It's in fact when we talk of development, we talk of unfolding. unfolding of the movements of the lever. It's necessary to teach how the levers can move relatively to the other. Of course, when they move very far apart from each other, let's imagine two levers that are jointed. Yes, when the extent of their development is the range of movement of the two levers away from one another. You must understand that my pupils have, or students have to learn this extent of the development, because the extent of the unfolding of the movement of the levers, because for a somatic habit of resisting anything that provides or in fact triggers a feeling of extension that people call tension. Very often after having somebody extend the torso, they wonder why they have such activity in certain parts of the anatomy, for example in the thigh or in the calf or anywhere, because they feel a tension, and for them tension is a synonym of wrong use. They do not understand that there is two kinds of tension. There are two kinds of tension. One is the shortening tension, the co-contraction of the muscle, when you try to stabilize the joint by making a very strong contraction on both sides, and you compress the joint. And they don't understand, of course, essential rigidity that you get through lengthening all the muscles and tendons, ligaments, and fascia of the joints. And then you get a position of, first of all, of good functioning of the joints, because instead of compressing the joints because you are extending the joint, you're in fact making less pressure on the joint. And second, you're getting all the elastic resistance to maintain the parts in the mode in which they should carry their function. That's very important to understand, that it's not only a way to make sure that the joint is behaving elastically, but it's also very important to understand that in this way we are protecting the functioning of the joint. And so all that, this teaching of the weight of the body, so I do teach to my pupil the weight of the parts and the extent of the development of the levers in order to maintain the equilibrium of the body. And the equilibrium of the body, very often for Alexander and all the people before this century, the body was the torso. So the criterion is a sort of balance, in a sense that we get this idea of equipoise. Equipoise. Poise means weight in French, and equi is equal. Equal force on both sides. This is of course, the criterion of the balance. We must find ways to balance the movements of the levers. And so this is going to be quite interesting, a bit too complex for this presentation. But you must understand that all levers have not the same shape. And of course, their extent is going to vary. And they do not also load the mechanism in the same way, because their weight is different. Their speed is different, their weight is different, so it's not a simple mechanistic study. The person has to be confronted with procedures in which the equipoise of the levers has to be studied. Now, we see that this leads us immediately to the dynamic. Equiponderant forces. Well, you use levers and the equipoise of levers, so the different movement you're going to want to command, want to order, are reason from this equipoise of levers, and these are producing equiponderant forces. Ponder is against another synonym for weight, and here we are going to come back to the static, of course, because it's from the static that we get this notion of the weight, from the static, from the position. And now the most important thing that for me was really a trigger, it was this idea of regulating the proportion of movements the soul should impress upon the parts, upon the lever of the body. That's my reading. Of course, it's not exactly what is written. What is written is the proportion of movement the soul would impress upon the body. But for me, the body is a mechanism. The mechanism is made of levers. These levers have different movements and different weight, and it's possible to, of course, regulate equiponderant forces. It makes quite some sense. Yes? And so from there, it's possible to come back to what Alexander is saying. And he's saying, for example, when he's talking about the body, what I call the torso, he says that the torso is made of two cavities. So he says, let us for a moment think of the thoracic and abdominal cavities and one fairly stiff oblong rubber bag. Why is Alexander describing the torso as a fairly stiff oblong rubber bag? You can ask yourself the question. I did ask myself the question. What is this idea? This is just a figure of speech, something you would write in a book that has no, impact on the way I teach. Well, it does have an impact on the way I teach because, of course, I didn't see it as a figure of speech. I started to think, wow, that's interesting. A rubber bag. A rubber bag is elastic and is filled with different parts of the working machines. We are discussing the levers inside, yes? And these levers are interrelated and interdependent. And what is interrelated is interdependent. I disagree with Alexander. It's not the parts. It's in fact the movements of the parts, for me. I started to construct a new translation. Of course, it's not written in the text. It's something you start to reason out, and you think, well, there are words missing here. In fact, the parts are not interrelated and interdependent. If you take two extremities, if you take, for example, the neck and the legs, are they related and interdependent? Well, it's their movements that are interrelated and interdependent. And the interrelation and interdependency is not only from the joints that are linking the different levers, it's because of also the ropes, the wires, the elastic tissues, the fascia system that is in fact relating the elements, but the idea of the rubber makes sense because there is something about a rubber bag. A rubber bag will link the elements, the distant element, only if it's stretched. Imagine a rubber bag that is set on the floor without any pull acting on it. It's going to be, even if it's fairly stiff, it will be formless. To get the form, you need to start pulling on the oblong rubber bag. And so the parts, Alexander tells us, are held in position by their attachment to the different parts of the inner surface of this bag. Well, yes, that's correct if you want, but it doesn't really triggers the right understanding, because if you collapse, well, of course, the rubber bag acts on the parts and to destructure their activity, to break their interrelationship, their interdependency. No. I started to view the image in a different way. I started to view, in fact, the parts inside as applying a direction of movement to the bag to which they are attached. It's not the bag that is, in fact, making the parts work in a certain way. It's the parts that, by their extent of their development, are in fact have the capacity to stretch the bag. And this capacity to stretch the bag is informed here. You can see that when you imagine, well, the torso, and you think, well, there are two ways to wear the upper torso. You can wear the upper torso very low, and you will find immediately that I've used here the trajectory of the transversus abdominis, and you will see that when the person is short, shortening the back means shortening the spine. It's clear that when you're shortening the back, the upper torso is closer to the pelvic bone, and therefore, of course, the bag is not stretched, and you have a tendency to see the abdomen protrude at the front. While when you suppose that it's possible to lengthen the torso, well, if you lengthen the torso, you must admit that there must be consequence in terms of the movements of the parts, and we will see that the thoracic object is going to be moved further up away from the pelvic bone. Therefore, we are stretching the bag. If we are stretching the bag, there are consequences in terms of shape that is quite interesting to follow. If you stretch a rubber bag, a fairly stiff oblong rubber bag, so if it's fairly stiff, you really need to apply some movements to the levers so that the extent of their movement is going to create a stretching. Yeah. And when there is a stretching, it's very interesting to see that any rubber bag responds in the same way. It narrows in the center. This is connected with something Alexander discussed in the first book. He says, we will suppose for the sake of our illustration that the circumference of the inner upper half of this bag is 3 inches more than that of the lower half. And he says, as long as this general capacity of the bag is maintained, the working standard of efficiency of the machinery is indicated as the maximum. It's quite interesting that to see that the general capacity of the bag, which in fact function with a circumference that is smaller, lower than the torso, because he says that when the circumference of the middle torso is wider than the circumference above it, it's all hell break loose. It's like he comments on it, you know, he writes about the disorganization of the breathing and of the digestive system, the problem of the bag, everything goes wrong when the person is shortening the bag due to the lack of extension of the rubber tube. And due to the lack of proper, you will see that in this case, of course, the diameter of the bag above is, of course, larger than the diameter of the middle of the bag. And so I started to really, observe that, yes, it is possible to organize the movements of the bony parts in order to stretch the torso. It creates all sorts of wrong feelings, all sorts of impression of doing too much, unless you play with the weight, unless you play with falling, unless you ask the pupil to start organizing these movements of the lever inside a fall. And I started to realize that it's exactly what Alexander was proposing to his pupils during the first training course. With the, well, now it's forgotten, but there was a procedure called the wall procedure. And the wall procedure has to do with organizing the extent of movements of the levers, of the parts, of the mechanism of the torso, using our weight, instead of using muscular effort in order to move the parts. Very interesting. So, and the process by which this is achieved is simply a readjustment of the parts of the body by a new and correct use of the muscular mechanisms through the directive agent of the sphere of consciousness. This change brings about a proper mechanical advantage of all the parts concerned and causes, thanks to the right employment of the relative machinery, such expansion and contraction of the thoracic cavity as to give atmospheric pressure its opportunity. There are different things that are of interest here. So, well, the first is simply the process of this by which this improvement of the working condition of the mechanism is done is simply a readjustment of the part of the body. Well, the simply is quite funny, in fact, because it may be simple to someone who has been through the training of conscious guidance and control. But for somebody that is following the somatic trend and feeling what is lighter, what is nice, what is, well, this is absolutely not simple. Most teachers that have had lessons with me tell me, but this is immensely complex. It would be much more simple or much simpler and to ask our people to just repeat, I am free. If you repeat, I am free, you get a change, an immediate change of feeling. Yes, but this is not concerned with a change of feeling directly. We are not interested by a sort of readjustment of the feeling sense. We are interested in employing a machinery. Very clearly, we are mechanistic in a sense. We are not of the superior thinkers of the psychoanalyst Alexander teacher that think that it's by the power of the mind only that everything is going to come into friction. No, we don't. So the directive agent of the sphere of consciousness. The directive agent is the agent that sets the instructions. It's the agents that guide how we are going to use the relative machinery. So here is an example. So this is an example of the wall procedure. And so we see that the student is standing at a certain distance from the wall. The distance has been established and measured. So we are absolutely clear, the student and myself, of where the student is relatively to the wall. And the student is, as in the Delsart system, started to use the weights of the different parts of the torso. And so how do we know? Well, we know because the movement is engineered in this way. The pupil at first cannot stand in the way shown in the picture 1. He would stand more or less in the way pictures shown on picture 2. So at first is requested to in fact lean against the wall, and to lean against the wall there is a procedure. I ask the pupil to, in fact, fall backward, but with the directive agent of the sphere of consciousness really informed, in the sense that we want the person to have several intentions of movements of the different parts. and of the different parts of the torso, of the different parts of the arm, and the different parts of the legs. So the mind of the person is full of intents. It's all a matter of intents and belief. And we ask the person, do you think it's possible for you to fall against the wall and reach the wall with the middle torso touching first? We certainly don't want to touch with the upper torso. We don't want to flatten the thoracic curve. We don't want the upper thoracic spine to go back. We don't want the cervical spine to go back. We don't want the head to go back. We want all this slot above the armpit line, above the lower part of the sternum. There is a grid line that you can see here, and everything that is above it should be away from the wall. So that's one part of the procedure. The second part of the procedure is not to touch the wall with the lower thoracic spine or the lumbar spine extremity first. We don't want to touch with the sacrum first. So in order to fall in this way, the pupil has not only to think in advance what we don't want, but he has to also to think well, of the intentions of movement that he must perform in order to be able to obtain the result that you see here. Yeah. And from there, we can reverse the direction of the procedure and then ask the student, well, to use the weight of the different parts in a very reasoned way. He's asking to fall, but this time away from the wall. There is falling toward the wall and falling away from the wall. And, well, it's obvious there is an essential rigidity that is seen in the torso, is seen. Of course, you may discover that is lengthening, well, and widening the torso, but more, you must understand that gravity is applying different forces of the different parts of the torso, and at the moment they are keeping their shape. This shape is the essential rigidity Alexander was talking about. It's absolutely clear that in leaning forward and in leaning back, there is no, of course, undue lifting of the front part of the chest. The person is not protruding the abdomen, and of course, the neck is not pulled back to pull the head back and down. It's absolutely obvious, yes? While this is happening, of course, I can discuss several aspects once the pupil is able to more or less use the weight of the parts and, well, direct the extent of their development in space, as it was shown by, explained by Delsart. Then I can start discussing details. So for example, there is one detail here, it's the extension of the knees. I'm not saying that the extension of the knees is correct in these four images, it's absolutely not, but this is now for me and the student an area of study, an area of experiments. Would it be possible to improve the organization of the movements of the parts of the mechanism of the torso? Yes, it would, but it may require to start to look at how the person understand or conceive what we call the extension of the knee. So we start to have an idea that the directive agent of the sphere of consciousness, of course, at first you have to direct the general coordination. And when you start being capable of directing the general coordination is directing intentions that are antagonistic. The doctrine of antagonistic action for me is linked with the machinery. The antagonistic action is that the intents of movement that you have in mind must be concerted, all the intents together, all, of course, one after the other, but the main idea is that if you start to promote one of these movements, so there are different arrows, you can see these arrows in the mind of the student are associated with the movement of a certain anatomical landmark on a bony part during the procedure. So during the procedure, for example, of falling forward, the pupil is in fact giving himself orders of movements. And for him, the game is to see whether he's capable of, in fact, adjusting the extent of their development during a 2-second procedure. So I'm asking the pupil to fall forward as far as he can without lifting the heels off the floor. It's a legitimate procedure, falling away from a wall. And during these 2 seconds, the pupil is, using the directive agent of the sphere of consciousness. And so we arrive to the second part of the little chapter we were discussing, where Alexander makes a new statement that is also very difficult at first to understand. This psychophysical factor. We were discussing the essential rigidity. This is what the psychophysical factor is talking about. You remember, I'm going to, in order not to lose everybody, I'm going to try and go back. If my computer wants to come back to, yes, that's better. So Alexander was saying, in the process of creating a coordination, one psychophysical factor provides a position of rigidity by means of which the moving parts are held to the mode in which their function is carried on. This was the first part that we discussed at the beginning of this talk and at the last and also last week. Now we arrive in the second part, and just after this sentence there is this new one. This psychophysical factor, which is the essential rigidity, also constitute a steady and firm condition which enables the directive agent of the sphere of consciousness to discriminate the action of the kinesthetic and motion agents, which it must maintain without any interference or discontinuity. At first, I couldn't make sense of it. At first, it was, I could translate the words, of course, but it didn't make more sense when it was in French than when it was in English. It didn't make sense. What are we talking about? Well, now, we have the directive agent of the sphere of consciousness. That is, in fact, generating what we call authoritative verbal instruction. There are verbal instruction that have, when we say it's authoritative, it has the power to be transformed into real movement that can be seen on the camera, or it has the power to prevent the happening of movements on the camera. So, for example, when the person is leaning forward, it is clear that the legs and torso are staying, well, in a relative position of extension. It's this constant tendency of the torso and limbs to lengthen is seen in practice. And it is seen in practice because of the training in conscious guidance and control the teacher has received before the procedure. You would be surprised if you were to film yourself just in this simple procedure of falling toward the wall and then falling away from the wall. You would suddenly discover that what this young man is performing is quite unlike the untrained habits of somatic teachers. Before leaning like this young Alexander technique teacher was not seen on film to lean in that way. This is an enormous improvement on his habitual movements, his habitual gestures. So, what do we mean by discriminating the action of the kinesthetic agent and the motion agent? Well, a diagram is the best. We have here some arrows. So I want the person to create intents of movement. So I want the inferior exterior part of the knee to move forward. I want the superior part of the knee to move back. I want the lower sacrum to move forward. I want the lower sternum or the ribs at the front of the armpit line to move back. All these movements are described, and we have discussed what they mean, and we have produced different, well, experimental procedure in which the pupil is starting to, in fact, generate intentions of movements. And the process does not finish there. The process necessitates that the pupil watch his own performance on video, like an observer, and verify that the intentions of movement that were specified before the procedure were in fact followed by the correct movements during the performance, or whether unwanted movements subconsciously performed were appearing. Well, very often, at first, of course, as soon as you ask a person to play with the habitual sense of equilibrium, which is what is happening either when you fall against a wall or when you fall away from a wall, the habitual sense of equilibrium is going to, in fact, take over the control of the production of the gesture. There are what we call kinesthetic agents. Is that when you start performing this action, you are going to feel a certain number of events, or the whole events as threatening, yeah, and it will be seen on screen that there are reactions. There are movements in reactions, and these movements are not part of the correct intention of the movement. The motion agents are suddenly disappearing, and they are disappearing and leaving the stage for the kinesthetic agents. That is, movements that are generated by a feeling. We tend, when we feel something, to react. And these reactions are not conscious, they are not planned, they are not anticipated, and they are certainly not reasoned. So suddenly, when you start playing at these lessons, you start having a clear understanding of what it can be to discriminate between the motion agents that are part of the gesture and the kinesthetic agent. And most of the time we will want to inhibit the kinesthetic agent and promote the motions agents, because the motion agents can be reasoned out, they can be thought about, they can be, in fact, we can talk about them. You cannot talk about your feelings. You cannot, in fact, convey your feeling to someone else because, well, they will not feel what you feel. What you feel is only subjective. It cannot be transmitted. A correct feeling cannot be transmitted to someone else through speech. You can more or less describe what you feel, but with your description, the person cannot do any sort of movement with it. While you can describe the geometrical extent of the development of a lever. That is absolutely possible. You can absolutely explain to the person how two bones are moving relatively to the other, and what is the extent of the movement that is seen when the person is performing. For example, if the person is not extending the knees properly, this can be discussed. Absolutely. We can absolutely consider the proportional movement below the knee and compared with the proportional movement above the knee. That is possible. And I've made a pun. Well, this is I'm not very proud of it, but I've taken a sentence of the books Alexander has written, and I've changed one word for you to find which one it is. So he says, now suppose that the teacher, after drawing the pupil's attention to the very disadvantageous manner in which he has been using himself during the process of extending his knees, giving some help, and succeed in inducing him to bend his knees to the best advantage in the general use of his mechanisms. When this occurs, the act of extending the knees becomes, as far as this pupil is concerned, to all intents and purposes, a new act, bringing with it a new feeling. This time, the act is not what he is accustomed to, and so it feels wrong to him. I've changed one word only. So, this is something I have noticed when working with leaning forward and leaning back. But it involves the feeling of disequilibrium. So you would say it triggers the reaction to the habitual sense of equilibrium. The teacher has an habitual sense of equilibrium that is a feeling. The person is going to feel, and when the person is starting to lean forward, there are reactions at the knees. So the wanted movements that are discussed are to have the superior interior part of the knee move back, while the inferior exterior part of the knee, the green arrow, is to move forward. And what is seen when the teacher is leaning forward can be discussed, and it is absolutely obvious at image 3 that the two images are not maintained. The two directions of movements are not maintained. It's absolutely obvious that the teacher is in fact trying to maintain his equilibrium by directing the inferior part of the knee, if you want, the lower leg back, while he's leaving the upper leg to move forward. This is exactly not the intentions of movement that have been discussed. And so, of course, the pupil had to deal with many other orders of movements. And for the moment, well, this is just a little defect. Yet, the coordination as a whole cannot be to be organized. There is some more work to be done, so that the pupil is going to start having a new conception of what we mean the extension of the knees when subjected to an adverse feeling. And at first you will discover, and that is the idea that Alexander is pointing to when he says to discriminate the action of the kinesthetic agent and the motion agent, is that at first the feeling has a strong action on the organization of the movement. At first the person cannot repress the habitual movement reaction. It's only after this possibility, using, of course, the essential rigidity, the firm condition, using the firm condition that is provided to the mechanism of the torso, then suddenly it's possible to use the new organization of the torso as a stabilization of the mind to start discussing movements that, when they are changed, produce very strong feelings of wrong movements, very strong feeling of something is wrong. And the person will start to be capable of creating these intentions of movements and maintaining these intentions of movement during the adverse procedure in order to discriminate and start inhibit the kinesthetic agents. The kinesthetic agents that at first are have full dominion over the movements of the person, suddenly it's possible to discriminate between them, and suddenly the pupil will have more detachment regarding his own feelings when leaning forward or back. And of course, if you can get a detachment from the kinesthetic sense when you are leaning in a difficult situation, either forward or backward, then of course it's going to be all the more easy when you're going to be simply standing. This is the idea, is that when the person learns to direct the mind in very adverse condition, we have, we trust that in conditions that are less difficult, the person is going to be able to direct the movements of the different parts easily. This is more or less the idea when the instructions given are carefully followed. So carefully followed means that the person has been able to inhibit the the kinesthetic agents. When the instructions given are carefully followed, the effect upon the whole mechanical mechanism of the person concerned is shown by the fact that when the coordinating principles brought about by this method are established, there is a constant tendency for the torso to lengthen, whereas the usual tendency, due to faulty standing position and the incorrect coordination which follow, is for the torso to shorten. This is the second part of the analysis of the doctrine of antagonistic action and mechanical advantage. The antagonistic actions of the levers of the mechanism of the torso are dictated, of course, by the directive agent of the mind. This is why I call these lessons I give conscious guidance and control lessons. What is in your mind?
I'm just thinking how interesting it is, the picture you showed of your pupil with all the doing the horizontal movements. So there was the green arrows and the purple arrows. So those are antagonistic actions because there's arrows going in opposite directions from one another at the same time. And by doing all those horizontal movements, you get a vertical change. It makes you lengthen, the torso lengthens as a whole just by doing the horizontal movements. It's very clear from seeing that image.
Yes. Well, there are horizontal movements when the person is standing upright, and when the person is leaning, these movements are 90 degrees to the plane of the torso, frontal plane of the torso. That's what we call horizontal. Yes. Yes, it's also indirect. The technique is also indirect in this sense. When we want to lengthen the mechanism of the torso, the technique is indirect in the sense that we do not think of pulling the structure to lengthen up and down. We discover that the levers are inside the oblong rubber bag, and they have to be moved relatively to another in horizontal direction, in direction that are in fact seen as parallel to the frontal plane of the torso. And the result of these movements, horizontal movements, it's a consequence, it's an end. We do not go for the end directly. Trying to lengthen, trying to think up, for example, is antithetic to the work we are doing. We are doing some a very intelligent realization that the machinery allows for this kind of motion agents to perform the result we want to obtain in the end. We are not doing the end. We are not doing the lengthening. Certainly not. The lengthening is a result of the means whereby movement that are antagonistic in nature. It's you must understand that this is a certain way to look at the text. It's a certain translation of the text, but it's a consistent translation. It's really possible. Well, for me, I have created now a system that makes some sense and that produces a lot of result in practice, in terms of lengthening and widening, of course, in terms of the new working condition of the self.
For definite. Okay, so we'll continue this again next time. For people watching, if you'd like to book a lesson with Jeando, you'll get a link underneath this video. Thanks, Jeando. We'll see you in the next video.
Thank you, Kevin. Bye.